He was born small in a world that measured worth by size. The plantation never called him by name at first. To them, he was the little one, the curious shape that followed the others into the fields before dawn. But he had a name, Peter Jackson, a name whispered to him by his mother before she was sold south. That whisper stayed in his mind like an ember, the only light in a landscape of endless dusk. The air on the Carolina coast carried the scent of molasses and iron. Chains sang softly when the wind passed through the rows. Peter learned the rhythm of that sound before he learned letters. He learned to move with it, to vanish in its pauses, to hide what he felt behind the kind of smile that made overseers lower their guard. From the start, he understood something the tall men didn't. Power wasn't always about height or muscle. Sometimes it was about the silence you could hold while others shouted. At night, when the big house lamps flickered out, he'd sit by the quarter's dying fire, shaping bits of scrap into tiny carvings. Animals, tools, faces he remembered. He sold some to other enslaved workers for favors. Others he hid in the dirt like messages to himself, proof that he was real. He imagined them as witnesses that someday, someone would find these fragments and know he'd existed. The plantation had a new manager that year, Mr. Hollis, a man who believed discipline was the same as order. His arrival tightened everything, rations, hours, and tempers. He had 4 deputies, each meaner than the next, men who carried their power in whips and boots. They looked down on Peter with a mix of amusement and suspicion, as if unsure whether to laugh or to scorn. To them, he was a novelty. To Peter, they were a study. He memorized how each walked, how each spoke, how each treated fear. Knowledge, he decided, could be its own form of weapon. There was a night when thunder rolled across the rice fields, shaking the shacks. Rain seeped through the roofs, turning straw into mud. Peter sat awake, watching lightning carve the horizon. The storm brought a strange calm to him. For the first time, he felt the idea that life could be different. Not easier, just his. He started to listen more closely to travelers who came through with news. Sailors, traders, a preacher who'd once escaped and returned disguised as a free man. From them, he pieced together stories of rebellion. Quiet ones, where people vanished into swamps and built hidden towns. Loud ones, where fields were set ablaze as a signal that someone had said, "Enough." The next morning, Peter carried that word in his chest like a secret. Enough. He began helping others in small ways, passing messages, teaching the illiterate to mark their names, stealing seconds of rest for the exhausted, each act tiny like his carvings. But together they formed something larger, the sense that one man's courage could multiply. There was danger in that hope. One of Hollis's deputies noticed Peter lingering near the stables and accused him of theft. The punishment was public humiliation, a spectacle meant to break him. He was forced to stand on a crate while the men laughed, yet as he stood there, the laughter echoing, something inside him hardened into steel. He realized that the same people who thought him small needed him to feel smaller. If he refused, they lost control. That night he didn't sleep. He sat outside, feeling the rough earth under his palms. "They think they own the ground," he murmured. "But the ground belongs to everyone who bleeds into it." He began to plan, not revenge exactly, but escape. Not flight, but transformation. He would find a way to turn his size, his invisibility, into freedom. The other workers whispered that he was reckless, but a few saw the spark in his eyes and listened when he spoke of routes through the marshes and of signals carved into fence posts. Days passed, each the same, until the morning when the overseers ordered double work for half rations. Something in the air changed. Even the birds were silent. Peter felt it, the wait before a storm. He knew the moment had come to choose, accept life as it was or risk everything for a chance at dignity. He looked across the fields, where the sun burned through mist. Every stalk of rice glistened like a blade. In that shimmering light, he imagined all the faces that had vanished, his mother's, his friends, the countless others erased by cruelty. Their memories stood beside him, quiet but unyielding. He breathed in deeply. The air tasted of metal and rain. The choice no longer felt like his alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told they were less than whole. That day, he would act. How no one knew yet. What mattered was that the decision existed. that a line had been drawn in a world that pretended lines didn't exist. As evening fell, the sky turned the color of bruised fruit. He hid his carvings in the soil one last time and whispered to them, "If anyone finds you, tell them Peter Jackson lived." Then he rose, walking toward the horizon where the swamp began, small in stature but towering in resolve. A man carrying generations of silence about to turn that silence into thunder. Dawn broke over the marsh with a muted hush, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. Peter moved through the wet grass like a shadow stitched to the earth. Each step was deliberate, each sound measured against the hum of insects and the distant croak of frogs. The world seemed endless, but in that expanse he felt something new, possession of his own motion. He had spent years studying the rhythms of the plantation. When guards changed shifts, when wagons left for the docks, when overseers took their breakfast, all that information lived inside him now like a map. He traced it in his mind as he crouched behind the mill, listening to the wheels creak. Timing was everything. The first part of his plan wasn't escape. It was communication. He needed allies who believed. The others respected him but feared what rebellion might bring. So Peter didn't preach. He planted ideas, small, deliberate sentences dropped into conversations like seeds. "Imagine if tomorrow was ours," he would murmur while passing tools. "Imagine a day without orders." Most nodded, wary. But some, the ones with weary eyes and quick hearts, lingered on his words. Among them was Ruth, a woman who worked in the weaving shed. Her hands were always busy, but her mind roamed free. She had lost 2 sons to the trade ships, yet her spirit remained intact. She listened when Peter spoke of freedom and offered him something precious: trust. "You see everything," she told him once. "That's your gift. You watch the cracks while the rest of us only see the wall." Together, they began to build a network of signals. A broken fence post meant safety. A blue cloth tied near the well meant the guards were drunk. A certain tune hummed during work meant a meeting after dark. These codes spread quietly, disguised as the ordinary motions of survival. At night, they met near the swamp edge, where the ground turned soft and fireflies pulsed like tiny lanterns. Peter would outline routes and assign roles: lookouts, messengers, decoys. He spoke not like a leader demanding loyalty, but like a storyteller reminding them of a forgotten ending. "We are not slaves by birth," he'd say, voice low but steady. "We are slaves by circumstance. Circumstance can be changed." Fear was their constant companion, yet it had shifted shape. It no longer froze them. It sharpened them. They learned to move with quiet confidence, blending defiance into routine. Even laughter returned, short bursts of joy that sounded almost rebellious in themselves. But the overseers noticed the change in the air. Hollis became restless, prowling the grounds with suspicion. "Something's brewing," he told his deputies. "I can smell it." They increased patrols, questioned workers, punished at random. That cruelty, meant to crush, only deepened the resolve beneath the surface. One evening, Peter watched the sunset spill over the fields like fire. He felt the old ache of uncertainty. What if they failed? What if all he built unraveled and the cost was too high? Ruth came to stand beside him, her face lit in amber light. "You doubt because you care," she said softly. "That's why you'll make it work." He didn't answer. Instead, he took a small carving from his pocket, a bird with wings spread wide. "When I was a child, I thought birds were messengers between earth and sky," he said. "Maybe freedom is just learning their language." That night, the group gathered for what would be their final meeting before the attempt. The moon was a thin sliver, barely enough light to see one another's faces. Peter spoke slowly, making every word count. "If we run," he said, "we run together. If we hide as one, no one left behind. If they come for us, we vanish before they arrive." He laid out the route, through the marshes, past the cypress grove, toward the old river crossing where, rumor had it, a sympathetic trader ferried runaways north. The plan depended on precision and trust. Each person had a role. Failure by one meant danger for all. When he finished, silence hung heavy. Then Ruth reached out, took his hand, and whispered, "Tomorrow, then." The words spread from mouth to mouth like a prayer. Tomorrow, sleep was impossible. Peter lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the quarters, listening to the breathing of those around him. Every sound was amplified. The chirp of insects, the rustle of straw, the distant creak of the main house shutters. He thought of his mother's whisper, of the name she'd given him, of how long it had taken to reclaim it fully. "Peter Jackson," he murmured. Still here. Before dawn he rose and stepped outside. The sky was pale gray, streaked with mist. Somewhere in that fog, freedom waited. He crouched to tie his worn shoes, feeling the damp earth against his fingers. For a brief second, fear tried to crawl back in. He pushed it aside. He had already crossed the invisible line inside his heart. He glanced toward the stables where the others were stirring, preparing for another day. Ruth caught his eye and gave a small nod. Everything was ready. And then, unexpectedly, something shifted. The sound of hooves, louder than usual, echoing from the main road. A wagon approached, carrying strangers. Peter ducked behind a fence post, heart pounding. Hollis's voice rang out, greeting the newcomers. He caught only fragments of their conversation. Rumors of disobedience. Tighten control. New patrol schedule. It was a cruel twist. Reinforcements arriving the very morning they planned to move. Peter's mind raced. He could call it off, wait for another chance. But another chance might never come. He looked again toward the swamp, where fog drifted like breath over water. It seemed to call him patient but insistent. He exhaled slowly. The plan would proceed. Not because the odds were good, but because waiting had already cost too much. When the bell rang to signal the start of work, everything appeared normal. The overseers barked orders, the fields filled with bodies moving in rhythm. Yet beneath that rhythm pulsed another beat, one only a few could hear. The heartbeat of defiance, steady and strong. Peter worked like everyone else, sweat on his brow, back bent under the sun, but his eyes kept drifting to the distant tree line. Every step, every task was part of a countdown. When the shadow of the barn stretched to a certain mark, they would move. The day dragged on, thick with heat. The air shimmered. Each moment felt suspended, unreal. Then as the sun began its slow descent, Ruth caught his gaze once more and nodded. It was time. The first step of freedom rarely looks heroic. It's quiet, almost invisible. A shift of weight, a breath held longer than usual. Peter took that step, blending into the tall grass, leaving behind the rows that had defined his life. The others followed, one by one, until the field that had always contained them stood empty in the fading light. The swamp greeted them with a silence thicker than fog. Every sound, every ripple, every sigh of wind carried weight. The air smelled of moss and slow decay. Yet beneath it was something almost sacred, the scent of life left untouched by masters. Peter stepped first into the muck, the water rising halfway to his knees. Each movement sent tiny ripples outward, swallowed by darkness. Behind him came Ruth and 6 others moving in a single file. No one spoke. Words had power, and out here even a whisper could summon danger. They followed the faint gleam of moonlight reflected on stagnant pools. The trees loomed like sentinels, their branches heavy with Spanish moss that hung like veils. Somewhere in the distance an owl cried, a warning or perhaps an omen. Peter's mind worked as steadily as his steps. He counted the distance between landmarks he had memorized during years of labor. The split cypress, the fallen log shaped like a serpent, the shallow rise where the soil turned firm again. Each marker brought them closer to the river and the promise that lay beyond. But the swamp had its own voice. Every few minutes something stirred in the water. Once a shape glided past them, smooth, soundless, leaving only ripples. The group froze, holding their breath until it passed. The air grew colder. Ruth's hand brushed Peter's shoulder. He felt her tremble but didn't turn. To look back now would mean doubt. They pressed on until the land began to rise. The ground became firmer, though the fog thickened. Ahead, through the mist, they saw faint glimmers. Lanterns. For a moment, hope surged. Then realization struck. No one friendly carried lanterns here. Peter motioned for them to crouch. He crept forward until he could see clearly. A patrol. 2 men on horseback. One holding a torch, scanning the swamp edge. The reinforcements Hollis had called for were already sweeping the area. The group huddled low behind reeds. Peter's heart pounded so hard he feared they'd hear it. He studied the riders' movements, watching how the light swung across the marsh. Timing again. Always timing. When the patrol turned toward the far bank, he signaled. They moved quietly along the opposite path, stepping only where his feet had sunk before. Progress was agonizingly slow. The air burned with the smell of torch smoke. A frog croaked. A bird startled. One of the riders turned his head sharply. "Hear that?" he muttered. The other grunted. The torchlight wavered, then swung dangerously close. Shadows danced across the reeds. Peter felt every muscle lock. Seconds stretched into forever. Then mercifully the riders moved on. The sound of hooves faded into distance. Only when silence returned did anyone breathe again. Ruth leaned close, whispering so softly it was almost thought. "They'll circle back." "I know," Peter mouthed. We moved faster. They pressed on, weaving through roots and thorns, guided only by instinct and the faint memory of maps drawn in dirt. Above them, the stars were veiled, but Peter could still feel north, the direction of hope, pulling at him like a current. Hours passed. The swamp opened into a clearing where a fallen oak bridged a narrow stream. They paused to drink, cupping water in trembling hands. The taste was bitter, metallic, yet to them it was the taste of movement, of distance from chains. Peter looked at their faces, exhausted, smeared with mud, but alive in a way he had never seen before. The fear was still there, but it had changed color. It was no longer the kind that paralyzed. It was the kind that kept them alive. Then came the sound, a single gunshot echoing far off. Birds exploded from the trees, the swamp erupting with motion. The shot had not been aimed at them, but its message was clear. The hunt had begun. Panic rippled through the group. Ruth clutched Peter's arm. "They're coming." "Not yet," he said. "They don't know where we are. How can you be sure?" "Because we're still breathing." He forced calm into his voice. Panic was the overseer's final chain, the one they had to break first. "Listen to me," he said, gathering them close. "We stay quiet. We stay together. Fear is loud, they'll hear it. Courage whispers. They'll never know where to look." They moved again, deeper into the swamp where the mud gave way to tangled roots and hidden pools. Time dissolved into rhythm. Step, pause, listen. Every sound became both threat and compass. When dawn began to tint the horizon, they reached higher ground. The air grew clearer, carrying the distant smell of river salt. Peter knew they were close. Beyond that river lay freedom, or at least the next chapter of the unknown. They collapsed under a canopy of vines to rest. Ruth leaned back against a tree, closing her eyes. Peter sat beside her, the fatigue settling in his bones. "When we reach the river," she said, "what then?" He hesitated. "Then we trust the stories. And if the stories lie?" He looked at her, eyes steady. "Then we make new ones." For a moment, silence wrapped them. Insects hummed. The swamp exhaled. The others drifted into uneasy sleep. Peter stayed awake, scanning the fading mist, thinking of the countless souls who had never made it this far. He felt their presence like unseen hands guiding him. When the sun finally rose, its light broke through the branches in golden shards. It painted the mud on their faces, turning exhaustion into something almost holy. They had survived the first night. That alone was victory. Yet even as relief settled in, Peter knew the danger was far from over. The river crossing was still miles away, and the patrols would not rest. He thought of Hollis, of the man's cold certainty that control was unbreakable, and felt a strange calm. Control was an illusion, and he had just proved it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out another carving, one he had kept hidden from even Ruth. It was a small figure, rough and unfinished, standing tall despite its size. He turned it over in his hand, tracing the marks. "They'll tell our story someday," he whispered. "But not like theirs. Ours will begin with fire and end with flight." Ruth stirred beside him. "Talking to ghosts again?" she murmured. He smiled faintly. "They listen better than the living." They rose, gathering the group. The day ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But for now, the simple act of standing beneath an open sky was enough. Peter looked toward the horizon and felt, for the first time, that he was not small at all. He was part of something vast, an echo that began in suffering but would end in freedom. By midday, the swamp thinned into wide flats of reeds. The air shimmered with heat. Even the insects had fallen silent. Somewhere beyond the next rise, Peter knew, the river bent east toward the sea. That curve was the border between worlds, one ruled by chains, one promised by rumor. The group moved carefully, every motion slowed by fatigue. Mud clung to their clothes. Their feet left dark ghosts on the sand. When at last the trees opened, the river appeared. Wide, slow, glinting like a blade under the sun. They stopped in awe. Freedom had a color, silver and blinding. Ruth dropped to her knees, scooping water in both hands. "Smell that," she whispered. "Salt and wind." "That's the smell of distance." For a moment, no one spoke. The river was beautiful but merciless, the current strong enough to drag a log under. Peter studied its surface, then the far bank where tall grass swayed in a breeze that didn't reach them. Somewhere out there waited the trader they'd heard about, the man who ferried fugitives north for a price. Whether he was real or myth, they were about to find out. They sheltered beneath a stand of willows hidden from open view. Peter sent 2 men to scout downstream for any sign of movement, while the others rested. Ruth began cleaning shallow cuts on her arms with river water. "We made it this far," she said. "That counts for something?" "It counts for everything," Peter replied, though his gaze never left the opposite shore. The river's whisper reminded him of a question he hadn't dared ask. What if freedom was another kind of storm, one that scattered them instead of saving them? The scouts returned near dusk. "There's a boat," one said, breathing hard. A flat-bottomed one tied under the big cypress. "No one around," Peter nodded slowly. "Then we move when night falls." They waited as the light drained from the world. Frogs began their low chorus. Fireflies stitched gold threads across the dark. Peter used the last of the daylight to mark a rough plan in the dirt. How they'd reach the boat, who would row, how to keep silent if voices were heard. Every movement rehearsed, every fear acknowledged. As stars appeared, Ruth touched his shoulder. "Do you ever think about what comes after?" He considered. "After what?" "After the running stops." He smiled faintly. "I think about breathing without asking permission. That sounds like heaven." "It sounds like work," he said. "But I'll take it." When full darkness came, they began to move. The river glowed faintly, reflecting the sky. Their footsteps were nearly soundless on the damp bank. Peter felt the cool air rising off the water. It smelled of mud and moonlight. The boat was where the scouts said, old, scarred by years of use, but still afloat. A frayed rope tethered it to a stump. Peter crouched, testing the line. It was brittle. One pull would set them free. He turned to the group. "Once we push off, no noise." Not a word. They climbed in one by one. The boat dipped, water lapping softly against its sides. Peter and another man took the oars. Ruth sat near the bow, eyes fixed on the far shore as if willing it closer. The first strokes were steady, slow. The current tugged at them but didn't fight. Behind them, the swamp receded into shadow. Ahead, the river widened, swallowing the moon's reflection. For the first time in years, Peter felt unbound by ground or wall. The motion itself was freedom. Halfway across, a sound cut through the night. A distant bark, then another. Dogs. The group froze. Peter's hands tightened on the oars. "Keep rowing," he whispered. The dogs' cries grew faint, then faded entirely. Whether they'd been imagined or real no longer mattered. Every heartbeat reminded them how fragile this moment was. When the boat finally scraped against the far bank, no one cheered. They simply sat in silence, listening to the river sigh around them. Then Ruth stood, her voice barely audible. "Step gentle," she said. "This is new land." They climbed onto the shore, kneeling briefly on solid earth. The sand felt different here, looser, cooler. Peter ran a handful through his fingers. It glittered in starlight like powdered glass. "We crossed," he murmured. "We really crossed." Beyond the trees, they could make out a narrow trail marked by wagon ruts. A faint glow flickered miles away. Perhaps a cabin, perhaps something else. "That could be him," Ruth said. "Or anyone," Peter replied. "But we've come too far to turn back." They followed the trail until the forest thickened again. Every step deeper into unknown territory brought both hope and dread. Freedom wasn't loud. It was a question whispered between trees. Now what? At last they reached a clearing where a small fire burned inside a ring of stones. Beside it sat a man in a wide hat, his face half hidden by shadow. He looked up as they approached but didn't reach for a weapon. "Long way from home," he said evenly. Peter studied him. Hands calloused, clothes plain but clean. "We heard you help people cross." The man tilted his head. "Some call it help. Others call it trouble." Ruth stepped forward. We can pay. Not money, but work. He considered this, then gestured to the fire. Sit. You look like ghosts who forgot how to rest. They gathered around the warmth. The man offered them a pot of broth that smelled faintly of herbs. No one asked what was in it. Hunger overruled caution. After they'd eaten, Peter said, If you can get us north, we'll do whatever's needed. The man poked the fire with a stick. Sparks leapt upward. North's a long road. You'll need papers, names, patience. We have patience, Peter said. Names, too. The stranger smiled, lines creasing his weathered face. Then you might just make it. He promised to guide them to a safe house at first light. Until then, they could sleep near the fire. Exhaustion overtook them quickly. One by one, they drifted into uneasy dreams. Only Peter stayed awake, staring into the flames. Each crackle reminded him of nights back on the plantation. The smell of burning cane, the sound of commands shouted through smoke. Yet now, the fire belonged to him. He thought of the carvings buried in the dirt miles behind, the small relics of a man the world refused to see. Somewhere, perhaps, rain would uncover them, and someone would wonder about the hands that shaped them. Maybe they'd tell his story wrong. Maybe that didn't matter. What mattered was that he had lived, chosen, crossed. As dawn began to lighten the sky, he whispered into the fading dark, The river took my fear and gave me back my name. Morning found them wrapped in pale mist. The man who had shared his fire, he called himself Jonas, rose before the sun, already tying packs to a mule. His movements were quiet, efficient, practiced. We travel light, he said, handing Peter a worn coat that smelled faintly of pine tar. Anything that can't fit in a pocket, leave behind. Weight draws eyes. The others stirred, rubbing sleep from their faces. Ruth stretched, wincing at the stiffness in her limbs. Feels strange, she murmured, waking up without the bell. Jonas heard her and gave a small nod. Freedom has no schedule, but it does have consequence. Keep moving, and it'll keep you alive. They broke camp just as the first rays split the fog. The forest changed color with every step, from gray to gold to green, as though the land itself were remembering what light felt like. For the first time, birdsong sounded like more than background noise. It was announcement, celebration, warning, all at once. Peter walked near Jonas, studying him. There was something about the man. His steady silence, his habit of scanning every ridge before stepping forward, that spoke of years spent ferrying others through danger. Why do you help us? Peter asked quietly. Jonas kept his eyes on the path. Once someone helped me. Were you? I was owned, Jonas said. Now I'm only indebted to the living. They walked in silence for a while after that. The path wound through low hills, carpeted in fern and wild mint. The scent clung to their clothes, replacing the swamp's decay with something fresh and startling. The others began to whisper, half incredulous, about what lay ahead. Towns where colored men could own land, churches where no one carried whips, schools that taught children their letters. By noon, they reached a weather-worn cabin half hidden among cedar trees. Jonas knocked twice on the door, then once more after a pause. A woman answered, middle-aged, her hair wrapped in a bright scarf. Her eyes widened at the sight of them, but she stepped aside without a word. Inside, the air smelled of bread and smoke. A kettle hissed on the hearth. The woman motioned them to sit. Name's Ellen, she said. You're safe here, for a night. Ruth exhaled, shoulders dropping for the first time in days. The younger men slumped onto benches, their exhaustion deeper than sleep. Peter remained standing, unsure how to relax. The cabin felt both comforting and foreign. No chains, no orders, just space. Freedom was louder than he'd imagined. Ellen watched him. You're their guide? Not by choice, he said. That's how it usually starts. She handed him a cup of tea that smelled of sassafras. Its warmth settled through him, strange and familiar all at once. Later, while the others rested, Peter stepped outside. The forest stretched wide, unbroken. He realized he didn't know where to look. North, south, anywhere. For years, every direction had led back to the same place. Now all directions were possible. The thought terrified him. Jonas joined him on the porch. The road splits tomorrow, he said. I head west to pick up another group. Ellen'll take you north to the line. The line? The border to free territory. Peter nodded slowly. What happens when we cross it? Jonas shrugged. You start over. That night, the cabin filled with the gentle chaos of new beginnings. Ellen's husband returned from town with news of safe passes and rumors of bounty hunters. Maps were spread on the table, candles flickering over them like restless ghosts. Peter traced the lines with his finger, memorizing the names of towns he could barely pronounce, places that sounded like promises. When the others had gone to sleep, Ellen sat across from him. "You carry yourself like a man waiting for permission," she said. Peter looked up. "Old habits die slow, then kill them faster." Her tone was sharp but kind. "Freedom's not just a place, child. It's a practice." He turned her words over in his mind long after she'd gone to bed. A practice. Something done every day, like breathing, like carving shapes from wood. He wished he still had one of his carvings, something to remind him who he'd been. But maybe letting them go was part of it too, burying the symbols so the man could rise. At dawn, they left the cabin, following a narrow trail that wound toward the foothills. Ellen led them until the path merged with a wagon road. There she stopped. "Beyond that ridge," she said, "you'll find a farm owned by a Quaker family. They'll feed you, give you papers, send you farther north." Ruth hugged her tightly. "How do we repay you?" Ellen smiled. "By living long enough to help the next ones." They walked until the sun hung high again. The road curved through meadows alive with crickets. For the first time in memory, Peter saw color everywhere. Wildflowers splashed like paint across the fields, the sky impossibly wide. Freedom, he thought, might be nothing more than the ability to notice beauty without fear. As they neared the ridge, he slowed. The weight of everything behind them pressed forward. The people still trapped, the silence still unbroken in the quarters. "They'll come looking," he said softly. Ruth answered without turning. "Let them look. They'll find ghosts." At the crest, the wind caught them full in the face. Below lay a valley of green and river silver, dotted with small farms. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys. It looked ordinary, peaceful, unimaginable. Peter felt tears sting his eyes. He hadn't cried when he was beaten, when his mother was taken, when the world named him property. But standing there, staring at a place where nobody owned him, the tears came easy. They descended slowly. Every step felt like shedding an old skin. Birds followed their path, swooping low as if guiding them. At the valley's edge, they stopped by a wooden fence. Beyond it, a woman was hanging laundry. Her sleeves rolled, her face calm. When she saw them, she didn't startle. She simply nodded toward the barn. "You made it," she said. "Come in before someone sees." Inside the barn, the smell of hay and apples filled the air. The woman, her name was Margaret, handed them bread and cool milk. "You'll rest here today," she said. "Tonight we move again." Peter looked around at the quiet space, the slant of light through the boards. Every small mercy felt enormous. He caught Ruth's eye. She smiled, weary but alive. For the first time, the word tomorrow didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a beginning. The first night north of the line was quieter than any Peter could remember, the kind of quiet that felt earned. Margaret's barn had given them shelter, food, and something rarer still, stillness without fear. Outside, the crickets played a rhythm like an old hymn, and the wind whispered through the gaps in the wood, gentle as a mother's hum. When morning came, Margaret handed Peter a folded paper. "Your name's on it," she said. "Your real name or whatever name you want to keep." He opened it carefully. The ink bled slightly into the coarse fibers of the paper. Peter Jackson, written in tidy script. Beneath it the words "Free Man," 2 words that made his hands tremble. Ruth watched him, smiling faintly. "Looks good on you," she said. They left at dawn, moving east this time, following a river that glittered like liquid silver under the sun. The road curved through farmland where nobody shouted orders. People waved from porches, not in suspicion but in welcome. It unnerved Peter more than the swamp ever had. Freedom, he realized, came with its own kind of fear, the fear of being seen. By noon they reached a town small enough to fit in a handful of streets, but big enough to hum with life. Market stalls lined the square. The air was thick with the smell of yeast and horses. No overseers, no patrols. Just men and women walking openly, laughing even. Margaret had told them to find a man named Mr. Alcott, a printer who sometimes took in travelers and gave them work. The shop was easy to find. The air outside reeked of ink and paper dust. A bell rang when Peter stepped inside. The man behind the counter looked up, spectacles sliding down his nose. "You must be the ones from Margaret," he said, voice soft but sure. Come in, come in. Let's get you settled." Within an hour they had food, a cot in the back room, and jobs sorting paper scraps. The work was simple, almost laughably so compared to what they'd endured, but Peter took it seriously. Each sheet he stacked felt like proof that his hands could build, not just survive. That evening, Mr. Alcott lit a lamp and joined them for supper. He was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a quiet kindness. "You'll hear things," he said between bites. "Some folks think freedom means forgetting. Don't let them tell you that. Remembering is part of the work." Peter listened, unsure if he was ready for remembering. Every time he closed his eyes, he still heard chains clinking, the dull thud of boots. But he also remembered laughter, brief stolen moments between the misery. Maybe both kinds of memory were necessary, he thought. Maybe one gave meaning to the other. Days turned into weeks. Ruth found work as a seamstress in a small shop run by widows who refused to bow to custom. The younger men joined a lumber yard, strong enough to carry beams that seemed impossible for their thin frames. Peter stayed at the printers. His small stature made him perfect for the intricate presses, able to reach and adjust the gears with precision. Alcott noticed. "You've got an engineer's eye," he said. "Ever think of building something?" Peter smiled faintly. "Only things that break." "Then start there," Alcott replied. One night, as the presses slept and the others dozed on their cots, Peter sat awake, carving again. He'd found a scrap of wood near the riverbank, a piece of driftwood, soft and pale. His hands remembered what to do. Slowly, a shape emerged. Not a bird or an animal this time, but a hand reaching upward, half open, half pleading. He stared at it until the candle burned low. Freedom, he thought, was not an ending, but a posture, something you had to keep reaching for. Weeks later, news arrived of unrest further south. People whispering about uprisings, patrols tightening the borders. Names of runaways circulated with bounties attached. Peter felt a chill when he heard his own name mentioned in a list Alcott received. "They won't find you here," Alcott said. "But if you want to disappear completely, I can help you move again." Peter shook his head. "I've run enough. I want to live." That night, Ruth found him by the river. "They're still hunting," she said quietly. "Even up here, I know. Then why stay?" "Because running keeps them alive in my head," he said. "If I build something here, maybe they'll finally die." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Then build," and he did. Over the next months, Peter helped repair the town's mill wheel, designed small wooden parts for Alcott's press, even taught a few children how to carve toys from scraps. People began to greet him by name. It felt strange, that name, spoken freely and without ownership. But the past had its own ways of whispering. Some nights he woke sweating, hearing voices that weren't there. Once a boy at the market pointed and whispered, "Isn't he one of them?" The phrase, "one of them," cut sharper than any whip. Freedom had changed his world, not everyone else's. Yet Peter refused to shrink. He began speaking in the small gatherings Alcott hosted for travelers. "You can't erase what was done," he told them, voice steady. "But you can refuse to let it define the next thing you build." People listened. They started calling him teacher. The word embarrassed him at first, then humbled him. He'd spent years being told what to do, what to think. Now people waited for his words as though they mattered. He wasn't sure when the transformation happened, from fugitive to man, from man to leader. But it was real. One evening, Ruth came to him carrying a letter. "It's from the south," she said. "Jonas sent word. Another group's coming." Peter read the letter twice, then folded it carefully. "Then we prepare," he said. "Prepare how?" "By making sure they don't just escape," he said quietly. "By making sure they arrive." He looked out across the river, where twilight gathered in deep purple folds. The water moved slow, steady, unstoppable. For the first time, he felt something like peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but of knowing what to do next. The letter from Jonas weighed heavier than any chain Peter had ever carried. Freedom, he realized, had not been the destination. It was the beginning of a new duty. That night, while the town slept, he walked down to the river where moonlight trembled on the surface like broken glass. The water whispered to him, names, faces, the ones still trapped behind the border. By dawn, his decision was made. He would go back, Not all the way, not into the jaws of the plantation, but close enough to guide others out. It wasn't courage that pushed him, not exactly. It was unfinished business, the kind that never lets a man rest until it's faced. When he told Ruth, she stared at him for a long moment. "You finally breathe free air and now you want to walk back into smoke?" "I know the paths," he said. "The signs, the safe places. I can get them through. And if they catch you?" Peter smiled, a thin curve of defiance. "Then I'll make sure they remember trying," Ruth sighed. "You always did have more stubborn than sense." But she helped him anyway, packing dried food, sharpening a small knife, stitching a map inside his coat lining. "If you die," she said, "I'll never forgive you." "Then I'll live," he answered simply. He left at dusk, following the river south. Every step carried a memory, whips, smoke, the smell of iron. But this time, the fear had nowhere to root. He was no longer the same man who'd crawled through the swamp. He was walking back as something else, a witness. 3 nights into his journey, he reached the first safe station, a farmhouse owned by a widow named Clara. She was pale-haired, with hands cracked from years of work. When Peter knocked, she opened the door just wide enough to see his face. "Margaret sent word," she said softly. "There's a group waiting near the old mill." "How many?" "5, 2 children," he nodded. The number pressed against his chest like a heartbeat. "We move tonight?" The moon was a ghost in the sky when they set out. The forest seemed to breathe around them, every sound sharper, every rustle a question. Peter led them single file, his small frame weaving through the trees with practiced stealth. Behind him, the 2 children barely made a sound. Their mother carried the younger one, her arms trembling from exhaustion but her face set like stone. By dawn, they reached the marshlands that marked the halfway point. Peter recognized the terrain instantly. The smell of rot and brine, the soft give of mud beneath his boots. It was the same route he'd taken once before. The ghosts of that night lingered here. He paused on a rise overlooking the swamp, feeling the pull of memory. "Almost there," he whispered, though it was unclear whether he meant the travelers or himself. The crossing took hours. Every misstep could mean noise, every noise could mean capture. Twice they froze at the sound of distant dogs, hearts hammering. When the last of them reached solid ground again, the children began to cry. Quiet tears of exhaustion and relief. Peter crouched, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Don't cry yet," he said softly. "Cry when you see the sky open." They moved on. The sun rose, bleeding gold across the treetops. Freedom was only a few miles away. But near the river bend, Peter spotted movement. 3 riders on the opposite bank. His stomach knotted. He recognized the way they scanned the trees, rifles slung lazily at their sides. Patrol. He motioned for the group to crouch. "Stay here," he whispered. He slipped forward through the reeds, keeping low. The riders spoke faintly, their voices carrying across the water. Words about tracks, bounties, prices, the same language of ownership he thought he'd left behind. For a long moment he stayed still, watching them. Then the riders turned and moved west, their silhouettes fading behind a ridge. Only when the sound of hooves died did Peter return to the others. "They're gone," he said. "We keep moving." When they reached the borderline at last, a simple ridge between one land and another, the sun was setting. Peter stopped, letting the others go ahead. The mother turned back to him, tears cutting trails through the dirt on her cheeks. "You're not coming?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not this time. More waiting on the other side." She hesitated, then took his hand. "Then may God walk with you." "He's walked with worse," Peter said with a faint smile. He watched as they crossed into freedom, their figures swallowed by the dusk. When they were gone, he sat alone at the edge of the ridge. The quiet felt different here. No longer the silence of captivity, but the calm of purpose fulfilled. For the next months, he lived between worlds, moving people north, carrying messages south, learning the hidden network of hands that stretched across states. Each journey left him thinner, older, but more alive than ever. The whispers grew, stories of the dwarf man who led people through the dark and vanished into mist before dawn. Some called him a myth, others swore they'd seen him, eyes sharp as flint, voice low as thunder. Back in the northern town, Ruth kept the signal alive. A candle in the window, a mark on the fence post. Some nights she sat by the river, wondering if he'd ever return for good. Part of her hoped he wouldn't. Men like Peter, she thought, didn't belong to one place. They belonged to the road between freedom and memory. Winter came. The rivers froze, slowing the work. Peter spent nights hiding in barns, surviving on scraps, his breath turning to frost. Yet even in the biting cold, he felt something burning inside him. The knowledge that each life he led north was one less ghost in the fields. He'd become what he needed most once, a guide through darkness. One morning near a crossroads, he found Jonas again, older now, slower, but smiling. "You're still walking," Jonas said. "So are you," Peter replied. Jonas nodded toward the horizon. "Freedom keeps moving. We just follow." They stood there for a long time, two men who had escaped different prisons, staring at the line where the sky met the earth. Peter felt the weight of years, of miles, of choices. He didn't know how many more crossings he could make, but he knew he wasn't done. Not yet. Snow had come early that year, turning the road south into a thin ribbon of white. Peter wrapped his coat tighter, feeling the ache in his knees with every step. The cold had teeth sharper than chains. He had grown used to hunger, to danger, to the weight of fear, but never to this kind of stillness. It was as if the whole world held its breath, waiting for something to break. In the farmhouse where he hid that night, frost crept down the inside of the window like writing from another hand. He sat close to the fire, carving again, a habit he couldn't let go. The figure taking shape in the wood wasn't a man or woman, but something in between, a form half-finished, reaching forward. Maybe it was himself. Maybe it was everyone still on the road. Jonas found him there at dawn. "They're holding people near the rail yard," he said quietly. "We can't wait for spring." "Too many eyes," Peter nodded. "Then we move now." By nightfall, they had gathered 6 travelers in a hayloft, 2 families shivering but resolute. The youngest, a girl of maybe 10, clutched a doll made from rags and straw. Peter crouched beside her. "You're going north, little one," he said softly. "Keep that doll safe. It'll remember for you." The journey that followed blurred days into nights. They walked by moonlight, hid by day. The river had frozen in places, forcing them to cross on cracking ice. Every step sounded too loud. Every gust of wind felt like warning. Once a lantern flared on a distant hill, and all of them dropped flat in the snow, hearts hammering. The cold bit through their clothes. Still, they didn't move until the light vanished. At the 3rd station, they found refuge in the cellar of an abandoned tavern. Jonas went ahead to scout the next leg, leaving Peter with the group. The air below ground smelled of mildew and dust, but it was dry, and that was enough. The mother of the little girl whispered, "You risk your life for strangers." Peter shook his head. "Not strangers, just people walking the same road I once did." Later, when the others slept, he sat alone in the dark, listening to the wind above. He thought of the town he'd left behind, of Ruth lighting her candle by the river. He missed the quiet conversations, the hum of the press, the laughter that had begun to sound natural. Freedom had offered him a home, and he had traded it for movement again. Was that loyalty or restlessness? He didn't know anymore. Jonas returned near midnight, breath clouding. "Path's clear till morning," he said. "But there's word of patrols near the bridge. We take the long route." Peter smiled wearily. "You always did enjoy the scenic road." Jonas grinned back. "Keeps the heart young." They moved again before dawn, following a trail through pine woods glazed with frost. The world glowed blue and silver. Every branch looked like glass. Peter walked at the front, guiding each step, until the trees opened onto a frozen creek. He stopped, testing the surface with his boot. Solid. They crossed single file, each breath a plume of white. Halfway across, the ice groaned, a long, low moan that silenced even the wind. Peter froze. "Slow," he hissed. One at a time. The group moved carefully, spreading their weight. The sound subsided. When the last traveler stepped onto the opposite bank, Peter exhaled and looked back. The tracks they'd left shimmered faintly, soon to vanish beneath new snow. By nightfall, they reached another safe house, a chapel hidden in the hills, its windows boarded, its bell long gone. Inside, candles burned low, tended by a quiet man named Isaiah. "You're welcome here," he said. "The ground may be frozen, but the heart still burns." They ate soup thick with beans and salt pork. The warmth loosened their voices. For the first time in days, someone laughed. The sound startled Peter. It had been too long since laughter didn't mean danger. He caught himself smiling, then felt the weight of it fade. How many times could a man build peace only to leave it behind? Later, Isaiah found him staring at the snow through a crack in the shutters. "You've walked far," he said. "But distance isn't the only road." Peter turned. "Meaning? Freedom outside the skin doesn't mean freedom inside it. Sooner or later you'll have to stop running both ways." The words lodged in him. When he lay down that night, they echoed with the wind. Stop running both ways. But what was he without the road? The mission had become his name, his worth. If he stopped, he'd have to face the silence, the faces that never made it, the screams he'd buried in memory. Maybe the road was easier than remembering. He woke before dawn, unable to rest. The sky outside the chapel glowed with the first hint of sunrise, pale and uncertain. He stepped out into the cold, snow crunching underfoot, and looked east. The horizon was a thin line of fire. For a moment he imagined he could walk straight into it, disappear into the light. Behind him, footsteps. Jonas joined him, rubbing his hands for warmth. "Beautiful, ain't it?" "Almost cruel," Peter said. Jonas chuckled. "Beauty usually is." They stood in silence until the sun cleared the ridge. Then Jonas said quietly, "After this trip, I'm done. My bones are too old and my promise is kept." Peter nodded slowly. "Maybe I'll stop too." "You won't," Jonas said. "Men like you don't stop. You just change what you're fighting for." The words hit like truth. Peter didn't argue. He simply watched the sun climb higher, melting a thin layer of frost from the trees. Drops of water fell, glinting like tears. By midday, they were on the road again, leading the group toward the final ridge before the border. The snow softened, turning to slush. Mud clung to their boots, heavy but real, a sign of approaching spring. When they reached the crest, Peter looked back one last time at the frozen world behind them. Every trail, every hiding place, every risk. They were all part of him now. He whispered a quiet promise to the land that had both trapped and freed him. The valley below shimmered with new green. Somewhere in that distance waited Ruth, the candle, the river. He could almost smell the ink and wood shavings of the print shop. Soon, he thought. Just one more crossing. The thaw came suddenly. The snow melted into rivers that ran wild through the woods, loosening the earth, carrying away the winter's silence. Peter felt the change in his bones before he saw it, the heaviness in his steps lifting, the air softening, the sound of water replacing the long hush of frost. They were 3 days from the northern line. The travelers he led now were stronger than most. A blacksmith and his wife, their teenage son, and an old woman whose eyesight was dim but whose memory was sharp. She told stories as they walked, half prayer, half history, her words filling the spaces between footsteps. "Freedom's not the end of a road," she said once, her voice rough with age. "It's the start of a long remembering." "You'll see," Peter listened but didn't answer. Remembering was exactly what he feared most. That night they camped beside the river, the same one that had carried him north years ago. Ran louder now, swollen with melted snow. The sound should have comforted him, but instead it made him restless. The river never stopped moving. Maybe it didn't know how. Jonas was right, he thought. Some men don't stop. They just change what they're fighting for. He wasn't sure yet what his new fight was. As darkness fell, the blacksmith's son came to sit beside him. "Is it true," the boy asked, "that you once escaped through this same river?" Peter smiled faintly. "True enough. Were you scared?" "Terrified," Peter said. "But fear's just proof you still have something to lose." The boy considered that, then nodded. "I think I understand." He didn't, not yet, but maybe one day he would. Later, after the others slept, Peter stayed awake watching the stars. Each one looked sharp enough to cut the sky. He thought of Ruth again, the warmth of her voice, the light she kept in her window. He pictured her waiting, always waiting. Maybe it was time. Maybe the road had given him enough. At dawn, they crossed the final ridge. Below lay the valley, he remembered. Green fields, small houses, smoke curling gently into the sky. Home, if such a word still belonged to him. He led the group down the slope until the river widened into calm water. "That's the border," he said quietly. "Once you cross, you don't look back." They nodded, gratitude shining in their faces. The blacksmith clasped Peter's hands. "You saved us," he said. "How do we repay you?" Live, Peter answered. Live loud enough that no one forgets. When the last of them reached the opposite shore, Peter stood alone on the bank. The journey was finished. The forest around him sighed with wind, a sound like applause fading into silence. For the first time in years, he had nowhere to go. He walked north slowly, following the familiar bends of the river. The ground grew firm beneath his feet. The air smelled of cedar and ink. When he reached the edge of town, he saw the candle in Ruth's window still burning. Though daylight made it pale, his throat tightened. He hadn't realized how much he needed that small flame to still be there. She opened the door before he could knock. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she laughed, a sound like relief breaking free, and threw her arms around him. "You came back," she said. "Had to see if your candle ever went out." "Not once," she whispered. Inside, the shop looked smaller than he remembered, filled with the comforting chaos of paper and tools. The presses stood silent, waiting. Ruth poured him tea, her hands trembling slightly. "You look older," she said softly. "Feel it too, but your eyes." She paused. "They're clear. Like you finally see something." He looked around the room, the walls lined with stacks of freshly printed pamphlets, petitions, sermons, stories. "What's all this?" "Words," she said. "We print them for the ones who can't speak yet." He smiled. "Then let's make more." For weeks, Peter worked beside her. The rhythm of the press became its own kind of prayer. The creak of the lever, the thud of the platen, the soft hiss of paper. His hands, once used for survival, now built something that could outlast him. Freedom was no longer a place or a road. It was ink drying on a page. News traveled fast. People began visiting the shop not just for work, but for stories. They wanted to hear from the man who had crossed the line more times than anyone. Peter never bragged. He spoke simply, describing the road, the helpers, the endless courage of those who kept walking. Each retelling felt lighter, as if the memories were losing their sting. One evening, Ruth asked, "Do you ever miss it?" "The road." He thought for a long time. "Sometimes. It's where I found who I was. But I think I've walked far enough for both of us." That night, as he stepped outside to close the shutters, he noticed the sky glowing with aurora-like light, ribbons of green and violet flickering across the stars. He had never seen anything so strange, so alive. It reminded him that the world was bigger than pain, bigger than the borders drawn by men. He whispered a quiet thank you to the river. The road, the ones who had walked beside him, the ghosts who had taught him courage. In the weeks that followed, Peter became a quiet legend in the town. Some called him teacher, others guide, a few simply the man who came back. Children followed him in the streets, asking for stories, and he told them, not of chains or darkness, but of how small kindnesses could change the course of a life. Once a boy asked, "Were you ever afraid?" "Every day," Peter said. "But fear's just a door. You walk through it, and there's the rest of the world waiting." Ruth printed that line on a broadside and hung it in the window. People stopped to read it. Some cried, some smiled. The candle beside it burned every night. Years later, when age slowed his hands and walking became hard, Peter still sat by the press, carving small wooden figures for children, hands reaching upward, half open, half pleading, just like the one he'd made in the cold cellar years before. Each one carried a single word carved underneath, free. Years passed, and time, as it always does, softened the sharp edges of memory. The world around Peter changed slowly, like a great wheel turning one spoke at a time. The papers he printed traveled further than he ever could, some carried by preachers, some by travelers, some by men and women who whispered his name like a promise. Freedom had spread, not like fire, but like roots, quiet, patient, unstoppable. Ruth's hair turned silver before his eyes, though her laughter never aged. Their small shop became something of a sanctuary. Travelers came for work, for bread, or simply to rest in a place where no one asked where they'd come from. Peter greeted each one with the same calm warmth, never judging, always listening. He spoke less of the past now, not out of fear, but because he'd made peace with it. The nightmares came rarely, and when they did, they no longer broke him. He'd wake, sit by the window, and let the candlelight remind him that darkness had an end. One evening in late autumn, the wind carried a strange stillness. The town was quiet, leaves scattered in bright piles, the press resting after a long day's work. Peter sat outside, wrapped in a thick shawl, carving one last figure. A small man standing upright, chin lifted, eyes forward. His hands trembled slightly, but the knife still knew its rhythm. Ruth stepped out, carrying a cup of tea. "You'll catch cold," she warned. He smiled. "Cold can't reach me anymore." She sat beside him, watching the small curls of wood fall to the ground. "What are you carving this time?" "Someone who remembers," he said quietly. He looked at her, his eyes clear and steady. "Do you ever wonder if it mattered? All of it?" Ruth frowned. "What kind of question is that?" "I mean the road. The escapes. The fights. Did it change anything big enough to last?" She thought for a long while before answering. "You know what I think? Maybe the world doesn't change all at once. Maybe it changes every time someone chooses not to look away." Peter nodded slowly. "Then maybe that's enough." A week later, the first snow came, soft and thick. Children ran through the streets, laughing, their breath clouds of light. Peter watched from the window, feeling something deep and still in his chest. Peace, maybe, or gratitude, or both. He spent the next morning writing. Not printing, not carving. Writing slowly, each word deliberate. Ruth found the pages later, stacked neatly beside the press. The first line read, "I was born in chains, but I did not die in them." The letter went on to tell his story, not in anger, but in truth. He wrote of the fields, the escapes, the people who helped, the ones who didn't survive, the ones who did. He ended it simply. "If these words find you, remember, the smallest man can still shake the tallest tree. Freedom is not a gift you're given. It's something you decide to carry." He signed it Peter Jackson. That night he slept soundly, the first real sleep in years. When morning came, Ruth found him by the window. The candle beside him burned down to its final pool of wax. His face was calm, his hand still resting on the windowsill, as if he'd just been watching the dawn. The town buried him beneath a cedar tree near the river. On the wooden marker, Ruth carved his name and one word beneath it, "Free." In the seasons that followed, people came from miles away to visit. They brought candles, carvings, folded papers with names written on them. Names of the lost, the freed, the remembered. The printer's shop stayed open, run by the children Peter had once taught. His words, copied again and again, traveled further north, then west, then across oceans. Some said he'd been larger than life. Others said he was just a man who refused to bow. Both were true. Years later, when the laws changed and the country began to reckon with its own ghosts, one of Peter's pamphlets was read aloud at a gathering. The line that made people fall silent was simple. "Fear is a door. You walk through it and the world is waiting." The room stayed quiet for a long time after that. Someone lit a candle and placed it by the podium. One flame became 2, then 10, then 100. The light filled the room like a memory that refused to fade. And somewhere, maybe in the place where stories go when they're finished, Peter smiled. Because this, at last, was the freedom he'd fought for. Not just to live unchained, but to be remembered in the hearts of those who still dared to reach upward. The river still runs. The forests still whisper his name when the wind moves just right. And every now and then, a traveler passing through the valley stops beneath the cedar, leaves a carving on the ground and whispers, "Thank you." The hand he carved, the one half open, half pleading, became a symbol across the land. People hung it in their homes, carved it into doors, stamped it onto letters. It was no longer a plea for mercy, but a promise to keep reaching, to keep building, to never forget. Peter Jackson, the dwarf slave who once cut down 4 overseers and defied a world built to crush him, had become something greater than legend. He had become proof that no measure of a man's body can define the height of his spirit. And as the candle in Ruth's window burned, year after year, its flame steady against the dark, his story lived on, not as tragedy but as testament to courage, to memory, to freedom, forever reaching upward.